Alrighty, we are here today with week 5 of our series on apologetics, and just so that we kind of are all on the same page, you'll remember that we're going through the 12 points that show Christianity to be true, and we are on point 3 at this point, which says there is a theistic God, and so we are presenting several arguments that show that the theistic God exists, and we've already looked at 2 of those. The cosmological argument, which looked at the beginning of the universe and God as an explanation for that. And then we looked at the design of the world and the universe, design of life, the complexity, being that God is the best explanation for all of that. And today we're going to look at a third argument, which is called the moral argument, which is an argument that says that God is the best explanation for the moral standards that we have. So I know we've been kind of talking about science the last several weeks, so we're going to shift and kind of go philosophy today. So talk about morality. To begin with, there are essentially 2 opposing views of what is right and what is wrong, and that's really when we talk about morality, that's what we're talking about. What's right and wrong in terms of our behavior, in terms of the things that people do. And one view, which is very, very popular today, is called moral relativism. Today, sometimes you might hear the term postmodernism, and we live in a postmodern culture. And one of the great signs of that is relativism when it comes to truth and morality. And the moral relativism basically says that there's nothing that's right or wrong in an objective sense. Nothing is, there's no standard of right and wrong. Moral standards are subjective. They're basically your opinion. Everybody has their own morality, it is said. So they don't believe in any kind of objective moral standards, something that would be right or wrong for everybody. The other view would be that objective moral standards do exist. Matters of right and wrong are not based on personal preference, but on independent, objective moral values. These are values that exist beyond the person and that people need to comply to. So those are the 2 views. Either it's right and wrong is up to you, personal opinion, or there are objective standards that exist for everybody that are incumbent upon everybody. So with that, the moral argument I just put down, kind of in its formal statement, says that every law has a lawgiver, and that there is an objective moral law. Therefore, there is an objective moral lawgiver. That makes sense, right? All the laws that we have in this country have to come from somewhere. They come from Congress, right? Or it's argued now from the Supreme Court sometimes, even though it's not supposed to. But that's, for every law we have lawmakers. And so the same would apply here to the moral law. And the moral law would be a reference to those objective standards of right and wrong that exist for everybody to comply with. So how do we know that this objective moral standard exists? How do we know that the moral law is actually real? So we can look at it. Across time and cultures, and by the way, there are different ways of approaching this, and I'm kind of beginning with the approach that C.S. Lewis takes, and I think it's very, very effective. It was effective on me because it actually led me to accept Jesus Christ as my personal Savior after reading The Moral Law by C.S. Lewis. So it was very, very powerful in my own life personally. But Lewis said that across time and cultures there's been general agreement on the principles which constitute right or wrong behavior. Sometimes different cultures express right and wrong in different ways, but there's general agreement on what is right and what is wrong. And Lewis argued that these are called objective moral standards. And just to give you some examples of what we're talking about, people by nature want to be treated as a person and with respect, right? I think everybody would say that it's right to respect people and it's wrong to disrespect them. It's kind of just a general, people just generally agree on that. People generally agree that it's not right to steal what belongs to someone else whenever you want. Yeah, if I walk into, or someone walks into this classroom and says, "Hey, I like your watch," and takes it, I think everybody would agree that's wrong. Okay, that's just something that's wrong. Who's ever thought that being cruel to children is morally right? We can all agree that would be wrong. Who believes it's better to hurt than to help? Who believes that it's always better to lie than to tell the truth? So these are just some examples of just kind of intuitively, we know what is right and what is wrong. You don't necessarily even have to go to school to learn all this, although it's wise if it's taught in school. But we kind of just know these things intuitively. Certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And C.S. Lewis had a great approach to this. He said, you know that these things are true because people tend to be so uncomfortable when they break one of these standards or one of these rules that they make excuses as to why it's not really their fault. Like, I know I broke it, but it really wasn't my fault. And it's very, very interesting. You hear these expressions all the time. For example, I'm sorry, I didn't know that you were sitting there. Because there's this unspoken rule that if someone has a seat and they get up for a moment and you sit there, it's not right. The person should be allowed to go back and sit there. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that this was your seat. I wasn't trying to steal your seat because I know that that's morally wrong. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in line. How many times are you in the grocery store, right? I do this all the time. I'm in the grocery store and I'm in a hurry and they don't have enough cashiers there. And so there's a little bit of a line, and you don't want somebody like cutting in front of you. What's your reaction when that happens? The line back here, buddy, No one likes that. No one agrees that that's the right thing to do. So if you do it, and I've even done it at times, you waiting for at the deli counter where there's not really a line, there's just a bunch of people there. But, I can remember once I was just about to order, to step up and give and I realized, I think this guy was ahead of me. And he was, and I just said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, that you were, so I apologized because I didn't want to be cutting in front of him. And that,
take your number.
Yeah, take it, I know, he's supposed to take the number now. So the store is smart, they know that this is a problem. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry, we know that interrupting others is wrong. I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention. And a great one is, we all know that we should keep our promises. I think everybody would agree with that. And so what happens when you break a promise? You hear things like, I know, honey, I promised to be home on time, but there was so much traffic. Or, but my boss made me work late again. So there's an excuse. I didn't really break my promise because that would be wrong. I had a reason for doing it, so I'm off the hook. And so we tend to hear these expressions all the time because people are very uncomfortable about breaking these moral standards, about doing something that they know that deep down inside is really wrong. Maybe some of you have made up your own too. But the interesting thing is that as much as we try and make up these excuses, we know that we do break these standards from time to time. We do know that we are not successful 100% of the time in following what we know to be right and wrong. We mess up. Nobody's perfect. And it bothers us when we do oftentimes. But another way that we know that this moral law exists, and I thought this was a very interesting thing that Lewis said. He said, when you hear a cry for help, there's really two ways that you can respond to somebody calling for help. One response would be to go and help the person who's calling out, right? The atheist would call that kind of the herd instinct, to protect the herd, to protect one of your fellow members of the herd. But the other reaction you might have is to want to run away. Say you're in the city one night, it's dark, and you hear a woman cry out, "Help me." Now, the choice isn't quite as cut and dry, right? You might want to go and help. That's one instinct. You might want to say, the guy might have a gun, I don't want to get involved. And many people would choose not to get involved, and they would flee. They would go the other way. The atheist would call that self-preservation, that instinct for self-preservation. So Lewis says there's two. You could either go to help, or you could run away. Those are the two choices, the two responses that you can make. But Lewis noted that over and above those two responses, there's a third thing that would occur to you that's separate from the other two. That third thing would be that you ought to help. Regardless of what you do, you ought to do it. And that really bugged him, because he said, where does that come from? That feeling that I ought to help, regardless of whether I do it or not. And he said that is the moral standard that's impinging on us, that we all feel that we should comply with, whether we do or not. Very, very interesting. So when you think about it, nearly everybody agrees that some things are indeed objectively wrong, as we said in the beginning. And some examples of that would be torturing babies, rape, stealing others' properties, killing an innocent person. But the question becomes this. If the atheists are right, and humanity is really nothing more than an accidental combination of molecules, like we've talked about over the last several weeks, the atheists would contend that you can explain human life by accident. It started by accident, right? If you go way back to the primordial soup when all the chemicals are sloshing and swirling around, an accidental combination of just the right chemicals and molecules resulted in a living cell, and that grew and, ultimately became life and became what we have today in the world, all the different species through evolution. But if they're right, then all we are really, and all any living creature is just a different rearrangement of molecules. No different really from this podium. The podium is just a particular arrangement of molecules. I'm just a different arrangement of molecules. It's all just molecules. And the thing is that molecules don't have morality. Molecules do not have, Frank Turek famously said that in his book, Stealing from God. Molecules do not have morality. How could we, if we're just molecules, how could we have all this agreement on what is right and what is wrong? See, there'd be no way to really explain that. If we're all just molecules and we have the ability to think, we would all have our own version of what's right and what's wrong. And that's what the moral relativists try to argue, because most of them are atheists and they don't accept the fact that there's a God. So I would just ask, why is there all this agreement on what is right and what is wrong if we're just molecules? It doesn't seem to make sense to me. It seems like there's another explanation. Of course, Lewis said that the explanation was, of course, God. God placing these standards in our hearts. That was the best explanation, and that affected C.S. Lewis as well. The interesting thing, too, is that while moral relativists, they do believe in right and wrong. I mean, when you have people who believe in moral relativism, it's not that they don't have any belief in right and wrong. Some of them are very, very moral people. The problem is that they have no basis for their right and wrong beliefs. There's nothing to base that on, because in that case, their opinions serve as the basis for what's right and wrong, right? If there's no objective standard, then it does come down to each person thinking, well, I think this is right, you might think that's right. We just disagree. But if that's the case, then everybody's moral set would be equal, right? No one would have authority over another person. If it's all a matter of opinion, then what I think is morally right and wrong is no better than what you think is morally right and wrong. It's all just opinion. And the problem is when you come down to certain moralities, people saying that the Nazi morality was let's kill every Jew that we can find, men, women, and children. And they proceeded to do just that. Well, who's to say that that's really wrong in any kind of objective sense? You see, if morality is just a matter of opinion, who's to say that's wrong? Who's to judge them? You can't. That's just their opinion. They're entitled to it, right? So you have, someone like a Mother Teresa on one hand, right? You're familiar with Mother Teresa, who goes around the world dedicating her life to helping the poor, right? Sacrificing every luxury and material thing she had just to help people who are in poverty. And we all say, wow, that's really morally great. That's a very high morality that she had. And you compare that to Adolf Hitler and his morality, and you have to say, on what basis are you judging one to be good and one to be not good? See, if the atheists are right and it's all a matter of opinion, there's nothing to adjudicate between those two moralities. One would have to be just as authoritative and correct as the other, just opinion. And yet, in our hearts, what happens? We know that Hitler was wrong, and what Mother Teresa did was good, was morally good. So how do you explain that? The basis upon which we govern right and wrong is very, very important, and it cannot be personal opinion. That leads us down a road that is very, very, that we intuitively know is very wrong. A lot of criminals are arrested for stealing, and what they could argue, well, but stealing's okay for me. That's just part of my morality. You can't put me in jail. You see where that would lead us to, and this is the problem that the moral relativists have. They really can't live out their own morality. If it's really all a matter of opinion, they have no right to put somebody in jail for stealing, because hey, that's their morality. They should be entitled to that. The fact that there is a moral law is most clearly revealed in how people react when things go wrong for them. For example, when a moral relativist is treated unfairly in some way, let's say the moral relativist, I've noticed everybody has a cell phone these days. For a long time I avoided that, but eventually my kids just said, Dad, you're just not cool if you don't have a cell phone, so I had to get a cell phone. Right? So, but now I've learned to use it, it's all good. But the moral relativist is, if someone steals that person's cell phone, how do they react? Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's that person's morality. The thief's morality is to steal, and he's entitled to that, so hey, he stole my cell phone, hey, that's okay. Of course not. Never. They would go, wait a minute, give me that thing back. That's wrong. You can't steal my phone. That's wrong. Suddenly there's a moral objective standard in place when it happens to you, when it happens to that person. So by the way that people react, you can tell that there's a moral standard in place, whether they want to admit it or not. My former professor, Dr. Geisler, tells this story of, I don't know whether it was him or, I can't remember now, it was a long time ago, whether it was him or whether he was telling the story about somebody else. But the professor of a philosophy class assigns this paper. And the students have to write this paper on some aspect of morality or philosophy, whatever it was. And so one of the students in the class writes this paper on the fact that morality is totally relative. There's no such thing as moral standards. And he goes through like this long paper explaining how everybody has their own morality, and it's not fair to judge another person, and it's all just a matter of personal preference. So the professor gets the paper and writes a big F on the front of it and gives it back to the student. The student comes into the professor's office and goes, "This is, you failed me, but this is an A quality paper. What are you doing giving me an F?" And the professor said, "Well, you turned it in a blue cover, and I just hate the color blue. So I gave you an F on the paper." Well, the student, what's the first thing that comes out of his mouth? "That's not fair. That's not right. You can't give me an F based on the color of my report." And the professor said, "Well, I just read in your paper that morality is completely relative. And it's all a matter of preference. And my preference is your report should have an F because it's got a blue cover," and handed it back to him. So that, the kids stand there speechless. He can't respond because he can't live out what he said was the truth. You just can't. When it happens to you, you can tell by the way that people react that this just is not, there are moral standards. There are objective moral standards that exist. So one way to discern this moral law is by how we want other people to treat us. See, even the moral relativist wants to be treated fairly, wants to be treated justly, wants to be treated with respect. And that tells you right there that there is a moral law in place. And it's kind of interesting, because in the Bible, this is exactly what we read when it comes to what Jesus taught about morality. Matthew 7:12, Jesus said this, "So in everything, do unto others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." What is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying that when it comes to morality, the standard that you should use is how you want to be treated. Right? You want to be treated with dignity and respect? Well, that's how you should treat others. And I think that's just an amazing insight into this objective moral law that exists, that we all act as if it does exist, whether we proclaim that or not. Now, one of the arguments that moral relativists give is that morality has to be relative because there's so much wrong that goes on. There's if the moral standard was there, people wouldn't be breaking it so much. And we look around and people do so many wrong things. The prisons are just full of people that have done wrong things. And so they would argue that there's no moral law. Well, the moral law does not tell how people actually behave. It simply says how they ought to behave. Okay? Murder is still objectively wrong, even though people do it all the time, right? There's murder sadly, all over the place, all over the world. There's lots of murders that happen. But that doesn't mean that murder is not wrong. It simply means that people are choosing not to obey the moral law, and that's something that people do all the time. People violate the moral law all the time. It doesn't mean the moral law doesn't exist. It just means they're choosing to override it, and we have that ability in our moral makeup. So the law is something that says, here's what you ought to do. So then, we back up and we look and we say, well, where do these moral standards come from? If there are moral standards that govern our behavior, how do you explain it? Where does it come from? And this really affected me a lot when I thought through this because before I became a Christian, I actually thought that the only reason people were Christians was because their parents kind of made them be Christians. When they were young, the parents made them go to church. And so you grew up believing this, and that's how we have Christians. And that there really wasn't any thinking people who were Christians. Anybody who put any thought to it would know that this is just a bunch of baloney. That was my look. And so I happened to come across this book by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity, and I thought, well, the title's kind of weird. What is it? I was just curious, start reading the book. I got to page 42. I was like, wow, this guy is smart. This guy can think. This guy's a Christian, and he's dancing circles around me. And it shook me up pretty bad. And but Lewis was giving this argument for morality, and I knew that I couldn't argue against it. I'm like, everything he's saying is exactly right. He's right. When bad things happen to me, I get upset because I know that they're wrong. And it just made so much sense to me. And Lewis concluded, and in his case, he said right and wrong, one of the title of his chapters is Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And he basically, as an atheist, was confronted with this notion of objective moral standards, and he had to explain as an atheist where they came from. And it was impossible for him as an atheist to give any reason why everybody would agree that certain things are right and certain things are wrong objectively. And the only explanation that there is that there is a God who has placed this in the hearts of every single person. I mean, he knew that it just came down to that. God was the only thing that could explain this. And the Bible talks about that. God making human beings in his image. And when he makes people in his image, this is what we get. We get God's idea of right and wrong kind of planted in our heart. And I think it's very, very interesting that this is exactly what the Bible teaches us. In Romans 2, verses 14 and 15, it says this: Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things required by the law, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. See, the morality that God gave to Moses when he gave the law, the Gentiles did not have. They weren't privy to that. God gave the law to the Jews and the Jews alone. But then they're saying, the Gentiles actually, some of them, are doing the same kinds of right things, the good things, the moral things, even though they're not Jews. Gentiles are being moral in many cases. And so what Paul is saying in Romans here is that they're showing that they intuitively know that the law is written on their hearts, part of their conscience, part of being made in the image of God. And that's just a very, very profound insight that the morality comes from something beyond us, something from outside of us, and is placed into us. And that is the perfect explanation why everybody agrees that morality is objective. People, different cultures express it in different ways. It's very interesting, but if you travel around the world, you'll see that people greet one another in a lot of different ways. Here in America, we tend to shake hands. But when I went to Europe, they often kiss you. And you might say, well, that's kind of creepy here, being kissed by somebody else. Since in many cultures, even men would kiss each other on the cheek, when they meet. And I'm a little uncomfortable when women do that with me. Yeah, it was a funny story because I went to Greece and I was teaching at the Greek Bible College. And the second year that I went back to do that, when I go, I also talk at churches, and they have me very busy. And so one night I was at a church giving a talk, and one of my former students was in the audience. And after I got done talking, I saw her, and so I went up to greet her. And there was kind of she was standing in one aisle, and there was a chair between us. And when we went to greet, I'm just like, I'm going to shake her hand, right? Because but she's like wanting to give me the traditional kiss on the cheek. And in her case, it's two. Sometimes it's one kiss, sometimes it's two. You never know. I don't know, what's that? No, Francois, tell me,
Up to 4.
Up to 4. Okay, here's a guy who would know. European, right there.
Is 5 adultery?
Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, that's so I didn't know about, in this particular case, it was 2, which I was totally unaware of. So I'm ready to shake hand, but she leans over and has her arms out, right? So I'm going to respond. I lean back over, and she leans over and kisses me on the cheek. But we're leaning kind of over the chair, and I'm kind of holding up a little bit. But I thought we were done with one, so I back over, and then she's like falling onto the chair because she wants to give me a second kiss on the other side, and it was just very awkward. And thankfully, I caught her before she fell. But she lost her balance, and I'm like, oh, brother. But that's, it can. Yeah, now that I'm glad I know up to 4, so now I won't back away so fast in case more are coming. But it's we do things differently in different cultures. But what's the bottom line? It's proper to greet somebody when you meet them. That's the standard. You show respect and you greet them in the appropriate way, whatever that appropriate way is in your culture. So different cultures can express that in different ways, but the bottom line is that you greet people properly. That's the respectful thing to do. And so that's, I just think it really demonstrates that there is that standard moral law that's there, even though we carry it out in different ways.
Ask Joe Biden.
Yeah. All right. So that is the moral argument for God, that only God explains morality as we live it out, as we feel it. So just to kind of recap then where we are, we've given 3 arguments for the theistic God, that the theistic God exists. And so on the top of page 16, let me just summarize those very briefly and look at the picture that's kind of been painted by these 3 arguments. We first looked at the cosmological argument, which argued that everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. The universe began to exist, so it has to have a cause. Now, what in the world could cause the universe to begin to exist? For the atheists, they have no explanation, because for them, nothing exists outside the universe. There's no supernatural realm, there's nothing. The only thing that exists is the material, physical world. And so you have to explain the cause of the universe. And so that whatever it is that caused the universe had to be beyond time, space, and matter, because those things are contained in our universe. It had to be something that was all-powerful and almighty. If you have the Big Bang Theory and you subscribe to that, as all scientists do, you have all of the matter in the universe condensed into one little point. It's infinitely strong. The gravitational effect in that singularity is virtually infinite. What would be strong enough to break that apart and explode it into a universe? Scientists have no explanation for that. But of course, if God exists, then that is very much an explanation, a more reasonable explanation, I think. The Creator is personal, since there can be no physical explanation for the start of the universe. leaving only a non-physical cause, such as a mind. And then whoever it is that created the universe had to choose to do so. So, being immaterial, being consisting of a mind with the ability to choose, I think points us in the direction of a God, a theistic God. But that's not all, because the teleological argument tells us that whoever started the universe must be highly intelligent in order to have designed it. There's clear design in the universe. There's unbelievable complexity and fine-tuning, not only at the large scale, but in the tiny scale of our cells in our bodies, the DNA and so forth. That much complexity and design has to have an explanation. The very first cell had to have DNA. And we said that the amount of DNA in a cell is equals, if you were to write it out in English, about 1,000 volumes of encyclopedias. And that's a tremendous amount of information. Had to be in the first cell for that first cell to function and to replicate itself. Where did it come from? Information only comes from intelligence. We know that. And so where does information come from in the first cell? Well, I think the more reasonable explanation is that it comes from an intelligent source, which would be God. And of course, the moral argument tells us that whoever is out there is morally good, because he is the one who has given us standards of behavior of right and wrong. So there's a morality aspect to the creator of the universe. So if we sum it all up, we can say that the cause of the universe is self-existent, timeless, and non-physical, almighty, powerful enough to have created the universe out of nothing, highly intelligent to have designed it, morally good, the source of moral standards, and personal to have provided personal moral standards for human life. You start looking at that list, and it starts looking a lot like God. And we've gotten here not even opening the Bible. We are arguing this on the ground that the atheist stands on. Okay? We could use the Bible, and we would be correct if we use the Bible, but that's not going to be convincing to the atheist who doesn't believe in the Bible. So what we're trying to do here is we're approaching the atheist on his own ground. And what we're discovering is that there's a theistic God. I think it's very compelling. So with a theistic God existing, right? If you look at the religions of the world, there's really three major religions that believe in a theistic God. That would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Those three religions believe that there is one theistic God that exists. So the question would be, which one of those three religions would be correct? Okay? We have a theistic God, but those three religions are very, very different from each other, even though they all believe in a theistic God. Which one is correct? And that would be the direction that we want to move from this point forward. Which of those three religions would be correct? Does that make sense? Are we everybody on the same page here? The next point in the 12 points would be this. If God exists, then miracles are possible. Miracles are possible. Not saying that any have actually happened yet, but wouldn't you agree that if God exists, then certainly miracles are possible, because that God would have the option of doing a miracle if he wanted to, right? Logical. What is a miracle? I would define a miracle this way. It's a direct act of God that can't be predicted or explained by natural forces and would not have otherwise occurred. That would be a miracle. Something that happens that you just can't explain. Sometimes this idea of the miraculous can be carried too far, in a sense. You know, if you're driving around in the city and you need a parking place really bad, and there's one that happens to be available, like right in front of the building you want to go into, oh, it's a miracle. Now, that's really not a miracle in the sense that we're talking about today. That might be God's providence. God might have orchestrated that using natural means. Okay, but the miracle would be the car lifts up, and moves over somewhere over here. Or the car just dematerializes in front of you and you take the space. That's more of the miracle. God can certainly use providence. He uses natural things to bring about things that he wants all the time in our lives. There's no question about that. The miracle is something that's much more rare. Miracle is very, very rare because it's something that is not cannot happen by natural forces. It would be something that happens miraculously by supernatural causes. Nature operates on the basis of natural laws, but intelligent beings can overpower them. Interesting. The force of gravity, right? That's a natural law, we would say. Gravity is something that exists in nature, and we're all affected by it. The fact that we're standing on the ground means that gravity's affecting me, right? Things aren't floating around. But we can overcome that law if we want to. And we've done that with airplanes, for example, right? We can overcome the law of gravity by going up in an airplane and flying to where we want and then landing. Very convenient. So if finite beings can overpower natural laws, it's obviously possible that an infinite being who created those forces could also do that. Okay? So it's just kind of an interesting thought that if we as mere humans can overpower natural laws, then obviously God could do that when it comes to the miraculous. He would have the ability to overcome natural laws, and we do see that in the Bible. We see it in terms of today. Some of you may even have experienced something like that in your lives. I know that you hear stories of people who are ill, who are sick, have a tumor or whatever, or have some kind of horrible disease, and then it vanishes. I mean, there's medical documentation that on rare occasion that kind of thing happens, and doctors are at a loss to explain how that could have possibly happened. So we do see it today, but it's rare. It's rare. It's not the way God normally operates. And it's even true that in the Bible, people think in the Bible that there's just miracles happening all over the place. When you carefully read the Bible, most miracles are clustered in three general areas. They're clustered around the ministry of Moses, and then around Elijah and Elisha, and then around Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament church. There are miracles occasionally outside of those, but the vast majority of miracles in the Bible are clustered around those three times in Bible history. It's very interesting. So it's not like God is doing miracles like every day in the Bible and then suddenly he stopped. They were clustered, and God did that for his purposes. But that's just to say that, generally speaking, they're rare now. They were even rare in biblical times as well. But since God exists, on the top of page 17, we know that miracles are at least possible. We have to allow for the possibility if God exists. And in order to become a Christian, you have to believe in miracles. At least a couple, right? You have to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's a pretty big miracle. Now, later on in this series, we're going to look in detail at the evidence that Jesus did rise from the dead. There's a tremendous amount of historical evidence that will, compelling evidence to show that actually happened. And we'll be looking at that in a few weeks. But the virgin birth, if Jesus wasn't also God, then we have nothing. Jesus was just a regular man. So the virgin birth would be something we would need to believe in too. So there are miracles that are necessary in order to become a Christian. The authenticity of the Christian faith depends on the miraculous. And here I've listed some of them. The resurrection of Christ, raising others from the dead. If we're going to believe the history of Christianity is authentic, there are examples in the Bible where other people raised people from the dead. Paul raised somebody from the dead. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. The virgin birth of Christ. The healing miracles. Jesus healed people all over the place. He controlled nature. Storms immediately quieted when he commanded. And so the authenticity of our faith does depend on these miracles being true, not just being a made-up story. But a lot of people say, man, it's just so hard to believe in miracles. Just so hard to believe in them. They're just so unbelievable, right? But I think of it this way. I think it's William Lane Craig, who was a Christian philosopher, where I first saw this because I think it affected him in his personal life. He at one point was an atheist, I believe, and had a hard time with miracles. But then he realized that the biggest miracle has already occurred, and that's the creation of the world and the universe. That is just a huge miracle. And if God did that, any other kind of miracle is peanuts compared to creating the world and the universe, right? So if God could do that, he can certainly heal somebody. He can certainly control a storm. I mean, that's just like nothing compared to what he's already done. I thought that's a very interesting argument, that it just opens the door for the miraculous when you just think logically. If God exists, you simply have to allow for that possibility. So the fifth point then, just to move forward, is that miracles can be used by God to confirm a message from God. And when we look in the Bible and we see those miracles that do occur, they have a point. God's just not, throwing miracles out there to impress people, but he's confirming a message that this prophet was preaching. And that's true when it's Moses, when it's Elijah, when it's Jesus, when it's the Apostle Paul, whoever it is, Apostle Peter. They have a message that they are giving that's from God. And so God uses the miracle to confirm them and their message. That's the purpose of miracles in the Bible. God is morally perfect, and so he would not act to confirm something that was true if it was false. Okay? God is morally good. He's not going to mislead people. So if it's his person, if it's Elijah, then Elijah is going to be able to perform a miracle in God's power to confirm the truth of his statement. It's pretty hard to argue with someone who's performing miracles saying that they're from God. You remember the story of Baal was a great example. It came down to the test. Elijah said, you take all your prophets, you Baal prophets, and we're going to go up in the mountain, and there had been a drought for 3 years. They needed rain, and Elijah said, here it is. Baal, you get all your prophets, put up your altar, you pray for rain. And they danced around, jumped around, no rain came. And then Elijah prayed, and he said, Lord, make it rain. And he took his altar, and they said, pour water on the altar to make it wet, just so that it's going to be hard to burn. Put a sacrifice on there. Prayed, and then God burnt up the altar, burnt up the sacrifice, and wow, that was very impressive. And so, but that was used to confirm the message of Elijah rather than the message that the Baal prophets were using. So that's, God can use miracles to confirm his spokesperson and his message. So genuine miracles that occur with a message confirm that message to be from God. And I just give a couple of characteristics for miracles as a confirmation of truth. And we see these in the Bible. It should be verified by credible witnesses. Lots of times we hear stories today of like some miraculous thing happened. But are they verifiable? Are the witnesses credible? Well, my uncle has a friend who had a cousin whose other friend said that they had heard that this happened. In the Bible, you have eyewitness testimony to these miracles. It's happening in public. It's happening right there. Verifiable. They should be truly supernatural and not just unusual. Sometimes unusual things are attributed to the miraculous, and that's maybe not necessarily this case. Truly supernatural, and in the Bible, again, we see those things happening. When Jonah's swallowed by a whale for 3 days to be in the fish, that's pretty supernatural, right? They should be connected with truth and not false teaching, and certainly for God's glory and not the person's glory. Every time there's a miracle in the Bible, the prophets are not looking for their own glory. They're not looking to be, to make a good living from it. They're simply there for God's glory. So, at this point, we don't know. Have miracles happened or not? That's the question. Have they happened or not? The Bible says they have, but if we're arguing this with a non-believer, then we're going to have to demonstrate that these miracles really are authentic, that we believe. And so that's going to be where we're going to go now. Has God used miracles to confirm Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, right? Those are the three. So has God used miracles to confirm any of those religions as true? And that's what we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. What has God done miraculously to confirm Christianity to be true? And if Christianity is true, the others by definition are false. because the other ones teach a very different story. Even though believe in a theistic God, their definition of God is different, and their teaching about how one is saved is very, very different. So if Christianity is true, the others are false. And so what our purpose will be here is to show that Christianity is true, that miracles do confirm the truth of Christianity. Any thoughts or questions?
I had one thought. When the Big Bang argument, starts from, you said, like something tiny explodes out into a giant universe, and the universe that it's expanding, and there's some evidence to suggest that that's how it started.
Right.
But it must be hard for the atheist, because everything evolves from that.
Right.
Life and animals and people and fishes and everything. Whereas God did it in stages.
Uh-huh.
It's harder to believe that it could start from just, everything could follow from just that first Big Bang into matter, and matter becomes life. That's a hard leap of faith to take, as opposed to recognizing that God could create the physical world and then add the atmosphere, and then add the animals, and then add the people, and so forth, as it's laid out in Genesis. And they mock that, and they find that that's fanciful, and that's hard to believe. But I was just thinking about it from a physical sense, from a scientific and physical perspective, and which is more likely to have occurred. It's much more likely to believe that a creator God would do it in stages, right? And that each stage is uniquely different, even though the building blocks may be similar, right? In terms of the molecules and the types of atoms that God used to create these different aspects of the physical world and flesh. That was one thing I thought was interesting. And the other is I'm still amazed at the information component of this. Is that there's billions and billions and billions of instructions of very precise pieces of information that are structured a certain way that bring matter to life.
Yeah.
That is powerful. That is awesome, and that to me is incontrovertible. That there is in fact an intelligent design creator that could only have done that.
Information only comes from intelligence.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that from looking at the world. Nature does not create information, not complex information, not specific information. Sometimes you look up in the clouds, you can it's kind of like a face, or maybe like in a horse or something you can see. But that's not a lot of complex information. When you talk about the complexity of the cell, you are talking about a universe of complexity. It goes beyond our imagination, really, inside that one cell. So, anything like that has to come from nature, from intelligence, because nature just isn't capable of doing that.
I like also too the example you gave about the explosion and then the random accumulation of molecules to bring something into being.
Right.
It's when there's an explosion, it's just destructive.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
sends everything off in different places.
Doesn't create design.
Doesn't create design.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true. Bob, you had it come?
Yeah, it's just interesting when you look at this complexity and you look at the little biological machines that we reviewed on, I think it was like page 12 and all that. God didn't labor over this stuff, he just spoke it into existence. And just the creation of Adam, he said it and it happened with all that complexity.
Yes.
Without, lifting a finger. That's a miracle.
It puts you in awe of what God is capable of doing. And when you really start thinking about it, that's why we worship.
Yeah.
That's why we worship.
That picture of that complex machine, and it had like it's like a rotor or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a motor and rotor and stuff. And I was just thinking about that from last week. That it's a machine, but it's also alive.
That's right.
It's matter that's doing complex processing and complex transactions and complex things. But it's also living tissue. It's living matter. That's hard to really understand.
It's hard to explain that it came from non-living. How does the living come from the non-living?
Yeah.
If you really want to get your mind blown, just Google biological machines
Okay.
on YouTube, and there's some like incredible animations.
Yeah.
It's just
Oh, yeah.
It's
Yeah, when I
insane.
teach this in college, I do show a video that animates the activity in the cell, and it just blows you away
It's
when you think that that's happening in every cell of your body. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. Well, at the bottom of page 17, we have David Hume's arguments. I'm not going to go into that. I knew that I was fairly sure we wouldn't have much time. You can read that on your own. It's very self-explanatory. David Hume was a philosopher, 18th century philosopher, and his arguments today are used by many atheists to argue against the miraculous. And so this is just simply a summarization of his 5 steps of his argument to say that miracles don't exist, and then the explanation is really quite simple. You can read that on your own. It will make sense to you, I believe. And if you have any questions, always feel free to email me during the week, and be happy to address that. But we're kind of up against the time, and so let me pray, and then we'll go on into church. Lord, again, we just thank you so much for all that you have done for us. You have created us, and you have not left us in the dark as to who you are, Lord. There is so much evidence that points to you. You have left your fingerprints on your creation. And just thank you so much that we're able to use this to confirm our faith in you. I thank you for what we heard today in terms of your morality. We know that you are a good and perfect God, a pure God, and just thank you for giving us the intuition of what is right and what is wrong, Lord. You have created us in your image, and I thank you for that, and I pray you would just help us to follow you in every way. In Jesus' name, amen.